Have you ever wondered how your camera calculates your exposure when you're in auto mode? Like when you're out in the sun, it just sets your exposure perfectly, and then you can move into the shade and it'll change the settings to keep the exposure where it was. But if you've been doing photography for a little while now, you'll know that it doesn't always get it right. So how do you change your exposure in auto mode? Well, that's where exposure compensation and metering comes in, and I want to explain how they work in this video and show you why you should be using them. If we haven't met yet, my name is Mike, and I'm an official Nikon creator and photography educator based here in Australia. Over the past 2 years, I've helped millions of people understand photography with my daily short videos on Instagram and TikTok. But this year I'm jumping onto YouTube because I think it's about time that I start diving a little bit deeper into my photography explainers and helping people just like you finally understand photography. This week I want to talk about exposure compensation because it goes hand in hand with what I spoke about last week, the exposure triangle. Exposure compensation is how you make your image brighter or darker when you're in any of the auto or semi-automatic modes like Aperture Priority. In order to fully understand exposure compensation, I want to explain how your camera calculates exposure, how you can change the way that it meters your exposure, and then some situations where you might want to change your exposure compensation. So what is exposure compensation? Well, it's really just a dial that we can move to the right to make our image brighter, or move to the left to make our image darker. Exposure compensation is basically the way that you tell your camera what you want the final exposure to be. And then the camera will calculate the settings in order to help you achieve that exposure. As such, exposure compensation only works when you're in one of the automatic modes. Exposure compensation in manual mode really does nothing because you're in manual mode and you have to change all the settings yourself. In the automatic modes, however, exposure compensation is how you make your image brighter or darker. Now, when I say automatic modes, I'm of course talking about fully automatic, but also some semi-automatic modes like Aperture Priority, Shutter Priority, and even Auto ISO. Anytime that you set your camera to auto, it's using exposure compensation to calculate the settings. So in order to fully understand how exposure compensation works, let's jump back a few steps and look at how your camera calculates exposure. In order to calculate the correct exposure for a scene, your camera uses an internal light meter. It basically analyzes the whole scene and determines the settings which will make the average brightness of each pixel middle gray. Yeah, that's right, your camera is trying to average out all the brightnesses from different parts of the frame to make it an average of middle gray. The term middle gray goes back to Ansel Adams, who first coined the term for zones in photography. He said there are 11 zones in photography, from 0 being black, 10 being white, and 5 in the middle being middle gray. Now, scientifically, middle gray is actually about 18% brightness because of the way our eyes perceive brightness on a logarithmic scale. 18% gray is actually half the perceived brightness of pure white. But forgetting all this maths, what does this all mean? Basically, if I aim my camera at a really bright scene, it'll start to darken the settings for me. And if I aim it at a really dark scene, it'll start to brighten the settings for me. It does this to always average out the exposure to middle gray. You know, fun fact, if I take a photo of a white piece of paper in an auto mode on my camera, it'll give me a photo with a brightness that averages around middle gray. And if I take another photo of something that's supposed to be black using an auto mode, it will give me an exposure of something around middle gray. Now, clearly both of these images are not true to life. One is supposed to be white and one is supposed to be black, but your camera is just interpreting the brightness of the pixels and trying to average them all out to be middle gray. And how do we fix that? Well, that's where exposure compensation comes in. We need to tell the camera what we want the brightness of the image to be. Your camera is not human, it doesn't know what the image is supposed to look like. When your camera calculates the average exposure, it displays it on a light meter. That's the little scale down the bottom or maybe up the side of your viewfinder. The middle line is the average exposure, or what your camera has calculated to be the correct exposure for that scene. Each big line to the left is -1 stop of light, or -1 exposure value. And every line to the right is +1 stop of light, or +1 exposure value. If you want to learn more about stops of light, go back and watch last week's video on the exposure triangle. But the quick overview is that a stop of light is either halving or doubling your overall exposure. So given all this, we now have a scale by which we can vary our exposure. If I press and hold the exposure compensation button on my camera, which normally looks like this, and then scroll the back wheel, I can increase or decrease the exposure compensation. At this point, I'm basically saying to my camera, whatever you think the correct exposure should be, make it 1 stop brighter, or 1 stop darker. If your camera is always making your images too dark, then make your exposure compensation positive. And if your camera is always making your images too bright, then make your exposure compensation negative. You're basically overriding what the camera thinks is a correct exposure and telling it to make it darker or brighter. And now it's not just plus or minus 1 stop of light, we also have more fine control over our exposure compensation. You might notice that as you change your exposure compensation, it actually goes up or down in plus or minus 1/3 of a stop. So each click to the right makes your image 1/3 of a stop brighter, and each click to the left makes your image 1/3 of a stop darker. But now hold your hats, because what if I told you that there was a way to stop your camera from analyzing the entire scene when it went to calculate the correct exposure, and instead it only looked at the important bits that you told it you wanted to focus on? Well, that is called metering, and most modern cameras have a few different options for it. You may have seen this button on your camera before and not known what it's for. That's for your metering mode. The first metering mode is called matrix or evaluative metering, just depending on which camera brand you use. This is the default mode for most cameras, and it calculates the exposure by analyzing the entire scene. Now, I'm sorry, I may have oversimplified metering before when I said that the camera just averages out the brightness of all the pixels. In fact, what the camera is actually doing in this mode is a complex series of calculations taking into account different areas of the frame, different colors that are in the frame, your subject distance, and where you're focusing. But still, even after all these calculations, it's still trying to get an exposure near or about middle gray. If you want your camera to stop looking everywhere in the frame, you can switch over to one of the other metering modes. The first of which is called center weighted metering, and this is where the camera will prioritize the center of the frame to calculate the exposure. In this mode, it doesn't just ignore everything else, but it gives a weighted majority to the center of the frame when it's calculating what the exposure should be. It does this because that's normally where the subject is, centered in the frame like I am here. But you might be thinking, can't I just give a priority to wherever I put the focus point? Of course you can, and that's called spot metering. Spot metering prioritizes the exposure of wherever you are focusing, no matter where that is in the frame. So on a modern camera, if I have face tracking on, it will make sure that the exposure on my face is perfect and ignore everything else in the scene. If I focus on a point in the shadows, it will brighten up the shadows and maybe even overexpose the highlights. That's because spot metering prioritizes wherever I put the focus point. And then finally, the last metering mode that we have is highlight weighted metering. Not every camera has this, but let me explain it for you anyway. What highlight weighted metering does is it prioritizes the highlights, so it won't let your highlights get overexposed. Even if you're focusing on something in the shadows, it will retain detail in the highlights. It won't let them overexpose, so you don't get home and open up your images and realize that they're all overblown and you've got no detail in the highlights. So yeah, you can change where your camera is analyzing in order for it to determine the exposure. If you've chosen your metering mode correctly, your camera will normally do a really good job of calculating the exposure. But if you've been doing photography for long enough, you'll know that that's not always true. Sometimes it will just be wrong, and you'll have to go in and fix it with exposure compensation. One of those times that it could be wrong is if you're backlighting your subject and aiming towards the sun or another bright light source. It obviously depends on your metering mode, but normally your camera will try and darken it down to compensate for that bright light in the back, in turn underexposing your skin tones, which is not always what you want. So in this instance, we can use exposure compensation to tell the camera, hey, make it a little bit brighter. I know there's a bright light source in the back, but I'm focusing on the shadows. Another time when you might want to use exposure compensation is when you're shooting in a really dark environment or even a really bright environment. Just like we spoke about earlier, if you take a photo of a white piece of paper in auto mode, it's not going to come out white. It's the same if you've ever traveled to the snow and tried to take portraits in the snow. Your camera will decrease the brightness of all of that snow in the frame because it's trying to make it more towards gray. You've got to tell your camera, hey, most of this scene is supposed to be bright and white, so brighten up the exposure. Images with gray snow just don't look right. And the same the other way if you're taking photos at nighttime. Your camera will try to brighten up the scene to make the average exposure middle gray, but things are supposed to be black and in darkness at nighttime. And that's a case where you'll turn your exposure compensation down to tell your camera, hey, I actually want this scene to be really dark. You might not care if you lose some details in the really dark areas because you're focusing on the highlights, but your camera isn't human and it doesn't know that, so you've got to override it with exposure compensation. Now, if you've ever taken the leap and flicked your camera into manual mode, you may notice that the light meter is still here. That's because your camera is always metering the light, no matter whether you're in an auto or a manual mode. But just because your camera is metering that light doesn't mean it actually does anything with that information. It just displays it on the light meter. After all, you are in manual mode, so you've got to do all the adjustments adjustments of the settings yourself. Nonetheless, the light meter can still be a really handy guide, especially if you've never used manual mode before. If you just keep changing your settings until that light meter is centered, that's telling you that your settings are what the camera thinks should be the correct exposure as well. If your current settings are going to give you an exposure that the camera thinks is too bright, you'll see the light meter towards the right hand side. That's basically the camera telling you that, hey, you're overexposing compared to what I think the exposure should be. Just remember though, the camera is 80% right 60% of the time. So take that with a grain of salt, but it is a very handy scale to have there if you're just starting using manual for the first time. Now, if you want to get really complex and actually change your exposure compensation while you're in manual mode, you'll see the dial move. It's not changing the settings when you're in manual mode, but it is changing the position of the dial. So it's a handy reminder for you to use as a scale. If you think you should always be overexposing, it will center that position. It's just a helpful reminder, but if you're not at that stage yet, totally fine. And that's basically everything there is to know about exposure compensation and how to use it. It's a really simple scale, but it's an easy way for you to start creating images the way that you want them to look and override what the camera is doing automatically. I didn't even touch on the different modes on your camera here, like aperture priority or shutter priority, but I think that's a completely different video. There are so many things to learn when it comes to using your camera, but I think that's what makes it so fun. But if you enjoyed this video, go back and check out the one from last week on the exposure triangle and stops of light. And if you've got any ideas for future videos, leave them down in the comments below, because I really want to make more educational content about photography here on YouTube. Until next week, guys, go and practice your photography. Get out there, start using your camera and change the exposure compensation around a little bit. Work out what these settings do and you'll have a much better understanding than just sitting here listening to me talk. But if you do like the sound of my voice, I'll be back here again next week with another new video explaining something else to do with photography.